I've talked about it before, but I don't. I think it deserves some reflection and introspection on the part of the people who are reacting. I get Westerners, non-Muslims, and so on, who come into the comment section to say, "We're not all like that. You're generalizing too much. There are a lot of good Westerners. There are a lot of good non-Muslims, or what have you. There are non-Muslim Western people who support Palestine, for example. You shouldn't generalize." I get this so many times. This is a strange reaction to me, and frankly, it's suspect. Like you think an exception disproves the rule, not proves it? It's so important to you to be regarded as an exception that somehow you want to deny the collective reality of Western barbarity, which then just calls into question whether you are actually an exception at all. I mean, why are you mad? Why are you triggered by the very true generalization about Western degeneracy and criminality, when if you are an exception, you should be as opposed to it as we are, rather than taking offense at it and acting like because you exist, it isn't fair to say it. You see? You can't even separate defending yourself and your own reputation from defending the West. Like indicting the West means indicting you, and you don't think you deserve to be indicted. You think I'm being unfair to you as an individual because I'm making an indictment against the West collectively. So what? In order to spare you, I'm supposed to not indict the West? In order to spare you individually? I mean, this very attitude is in fact a self-indictment that you, in fact, do identify with that collective so-called civilization and that so-called culture. What are you trying to do when you protest your own individual innocence in this case? You're putting yourself in opposition against the collective indictment, which, if you are individually innocent, you know perfectly well is collectively deserved. I've said it before. The West wants to take collective credit for anything positive that they might have ever contributed to the world, but they want to individualize blame for the innumerable atrocities that they've committed. You want the whole world to admire the West collectively, but you want the world to also be impossibly precise in assigning responsibility for Western wrongdoing. Like you do generalized bombing, but we're wrong if we assign general blame. You inflict collective punishment on Gaza, for example, but we're not supposed to cast collective blame on the West for doing that. In your mind, it's somehow worse to include an innocent man in a generalized accusation against the West than it is to literally kill innocent men, women, children, and babies in Western-backed carpet bombing. I'm sorry, but your feelings are just not that important. You know what I'm saying about the West is true, and if you are an exception, then you absolutely know it's true, and there's no reason why you should feel defensive. But I'm saying deal with your own people. Deal with your own so-called civilization, your own people, in terms of non-Muslims. If you're a non-Muslim and you think that whatever I'm saying does not apply to you, and you recognize that it does apply to your so-called civilization, okay, deal with your own people then. I don't think you can, because Islam actually is the only thing that can rehabilitate and reform your so-called civilization and your culture. But if you're not going to do that, then you go ahead and deal with your own people your own way. But don't come to us and tell us how to deal with you and how to deal with your people. Everything isn't about you. We're concerned with the economic sovereignty, political independence, and psychological decolonization of the Muslim world and the global South. But you want us to sort out who amongst you is and is not a Western supremacist. You're more concerned with not being blamed for your so-called civilization's crimes than you are concerned about the crimes themselves or about the victims of those crimes. And in fact, you want the victims of those crimes to attest to your individual goodness and your individual innocence. Look, I've said many times that the first victims of the West are Westerners themselves. Your own society has nothing but contempt for you and always has. But fixing the West is not the responsibility of the global South. It's not the responsibility of Africa. It's not the responsibility of so-called Latin America. It's not the responsibility of Asia. It's not the responsibility of the Arabs or of the Muslims. Our responsibility is to save and protect our own people. But you want the people you colonized, the people you enslaved, exploited, and oppressed to now become your therapists, to heal you from the trauma of your own dysfunction, the trauma of having been the world's most vicious tyrant. You want us to wash our blood from your hands. And I don't know, maybe you think that that we're not supposed to alienate you by talking about collective blame for collective wrongdoing because you think we need you to be our allies. But think that through. What are you actually saying? Are you saying that if you get unfairly blamed for being connected to Western wrongdoing, then therefore, if that's the case, you will not oppose Western wrongdoing? If we unfairly treat you as sharing the collective responsibility for Western crimes, you then are going to just act exactly like someone who does share collective responsibility for Western crimes? Like the only way that you will act like someone who has a conscience is if you get to be acknowledged and praised as someone who has a conscience. So actually, the only thing that matters to you is absolution. You're just trying to make sure that you aren't blamed. Like, if you think I'm a criminal, then I'll just be a criminal. The only reason to not be a criminal is so that people will tell me how good I am. That's your motivation. Because if you actually had a conscience, if you actually oppose the criminality of Western so-called civilization, if you are actually an exception to the general rule of Western criminality, well, you would be opposed to it regardless of what anyone thinks of you. You'd be motivated by your own conscience. But your primary concern would not be to be thought of as good. Your primary concern would be to be good in reality. Because if you're good in reality, if you're opposed to Western crimes in reality, then that the perception, the positive perception of you would follow suit. But you want the perception of goodness to precede the reality. In fact, you want it to substitute for reality. And this makes you anything but an exception to the general rule regarding Western criminality and hypocrisy.